Hello, I'm Ed Kelly, and this is AAIS Pulse. I'm coming to you from our new office in Boulder. We've had some delays in construction due to COVID-19, but we'll be ready for visitors once business travel opens up. A few months ago, we may have been the first in our industry to decide to pivot away from the in-person conference due to the coronavirus. Instead of our annual April meeting in Florida, we produced a virtual main event, providing a unique opportunity to engage directly with an impressive panel of thought-provoking experts. We covered a wide range of topics, from management and operational issues, emerging risk and regulation, data and technology, and developments in commercial and personal lines, and of course, the impact of COVID-19. Suffice to say, we found an audience. Perhaps it's our unique position as a trusted and neutral advisory organization, or our focus on modernizing the regulatory and compliance process in the industry. Whatever the reason, we are establishing a community of professionals interested in new and modern developments changing our industry. The AAIS Pulse News magazine provides an opportunity for us to bring that community together to share information, share ideas, and share success. At AAIS, we recognize the need for more sharing within our industry. In order to deliver greater value to our members, we simply must find improved ways to collaborate on the development for a more efficient and effective ecosystem. That's why we're redefining AAIS membership as an open platform where all members have full access to all our plug-and-play advisory programs and services, along with our open source technologies and tools, all for one single membership fee. Ultimately, we believe an open AAIS platform will promote scalability and speed to market, foster collaboration even among competitors, and drive innovation and greater sustainability for our industry. Open source platforms have spurred high growth and advancements in many industries. It's time for the insurance industry to jump in. In fact, here with a look at how open source solutions are transforming the financial service sector, I'm thrilled to welcome our own Joan Zerkovich and our special guest, Gabrielle Columbro, Executive Director of the Fintech Open Source Foundation, also known as Phenos. Joan?
Thanks, Ed, and welcome to Gabrielle Columbro, who is the Executive Director for Phenos, the Fintech Open Source Foundation. And Phenos is dedicated to accelerating collaboration and innovation in the financial services industry through the use of open source solutions, standards, and best practices. And Gabrielle has a long history of supporting the open source movement. He started his career working with Alfresco as the director platform that is used around the world by a wide range of industries. It's used by Liberty Mutual, LexisNexis, and AAIS. And we use Alfresco with a machine learning tool to create our clause library, which will be the subject of our next presentation. Gabrielle then went to the Symphony Software Foundation to develop software solutions for the financial services industry, and that led to moving to Phenos as the executive director, which joined the Linux Foundation in April of 2020. So welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. So many outside of the financial services industry may not know much about Phenos, and so maybe you can give us a little bit of a background about the formation of Phenos and the services that you provide to your members.
Absolutely. I'm really thrilled to be here, let me say first, because I think there is a lot of similarities between what we do in the financial services industry and I think what the opportunity is for the insurance industry. But Phenos has been now in business for about 5 years, and it's been already a long journey. We started in late 2015, early 2016. And I have to say, I had the honor to be called to run what was at the time called the Symphony Software Foundation, as you mentioned. who was created by some of the largest financial institutions in the world. If you look at our list of members, again, since the very beginning, we enjoyed the support of most of the tier one investment banks, both from the US and Europe. And I think that's really been the first factor that put us in a position of building something that, in 5 years has become the place where open source collaboration happens in the industry. So on one hand, again, I had the honor and the luck to be called to run this foundation. It was already formed a few months before I joined. But since then, we realized that there was a much broader opportunity. The Symphony Software Foundation was really geared towards creating collaboration around one specific piece of software called Symphony. Folks might not be familiar with it. It's actually a collaboration platform, chat collaboration platform, created by the largest financial institutions in the world. And that clearly, due to its nature, of being an end-to-end encrypted chat, of really having to be a regulated way of collaborating across the firewall between these investment banks, these highly regulated companies, it was identified since the very beginning that open source was going to be really a key part of the success of this platform. Very much, you cannot bring together, it's really hard to bring together 10 plus investment banks without creating the trust that I think personally open source can bring to the conversation. If you fast forward a couple of years, in mid-2017, we realized that there was a much broader opportunity in the industry. What we had, both in terms of the firms that were sitting on our board and members of our foundation, as well as just the context that was changing in the industry. The decentralized ecosystems, coming in the industry, the fintech wave, just simply this mandate to become technology companies, as most financial institutions are now sort of feeling that mandate. It really made us realize that we could expand the Symphony Software Foundation into what it is today, the Fintech Open Source Foundation, and really become the trusted, independent, neutral place, non-profit foundation that would enable this collaboration to happen. In terms of what we provide to members, I really tend to break it down, on your sort of standard open source value for the IT organization, whether that's a reduction of the total cost of ownership of your technology stack, whether there is, talent attraction and talent retention, of course. Those have been, over the last 20 years, very sort of concrete and I think recognized benefit of open source collaboration. But when you bring it to, such a highly regulated industry and very much our, vertical nature, there aren't, very many vertical open source foundation focused on one specific industry. Well, then you are on the hook in a way to deliver tangible, concrete business value, again, to the business. And so we, since the very beginning, have tried to play on both areas, mutualizing and enabling the technology organization to innovate faster, but always keeping an eye on, concrete use cases and business problems that we can solve for this industry.
Okay. So that's interesting. You mentioned large banks, financial institutions are your members. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, UBS. You normally don't think of these organizations as working together or being part of the open source movement. It's been primarily technology. So can you give us a little bit of an understanding of how these organizations came to the open source business model? How did, what were the key factors that those aha moments for them where they said, yes, open source makes sense when we're talking about this industry-wide work?
So I think there are a couple of stages that we went through here. I agree with you. A couple of years ago, I definitely looked much younger. It's not easy to, have the largest financial institutions in the world, A, collaborate with each other, B, be convinced that actually, giving part of their intellectual property away is actually, the strategic, the correct strategic move. And so, I think there've been a couple of moments here. The first one was really, recent, sort of few months after we created the foundation. Really in mid-2016, late 2016, there was a realization that the trust that, access to the code, prevention of vendor lock-in. I mean, this is an industry that, again, compared, you mentioned my past in Alfresco, I've had, the luck and, to always, I've grown up in the open source ecosystem. And so I've always been used to, even as a vendor, to consider the vendor lock-in prevention as an actual, selling point, as an actual value that we can deliver to your customers. And so, if you think about the financial services industry, it's still an industry that is very much vendor-led. There are, quasi-monopolistic vendors in certain areas. And to be clear, we're not trying to alienate in any way those vendors. We want them to be part of our collaboration. But I think in the first few months, the inherent level of trust that is brought in by collaborating in the open, transparently record every decision and every really meeting minutes out there, whilst on one hand it sort of clashes with your idea of financial services, it really brought in a new wave of again understanding of how things could be done better. And I think the second moment, as I mentioned before, was a little later in 2017, when, again, the context of the industry was changing so much and so quickly that these organizations, again, realized that the old way of building software and, even existing consortia in the industry, were struggling to sort of get adoption and actually bring a, very worthy effort to solve a common business problem to fruition. And that's where, with a couple of key collaboration, key contributions, the firms had a tangible understanding of, hey, folks, here we can actually make an important progress in terms of bringing some of these, common mutualized solutions to production. And I have to say, it's been a really fun ride. Especially this year as we joined the Linux Foundation, we're seeing, we're basically just scratching the surface. There is a massive opportunity across the whole industry, and we think beyond in adjacent industries.
Well, you make a very good point about vendor lock-in. Certainly that's been well understood by the technology community for quite some time around operating systems and other applications, which led to the formation of the Linux Foundation. And there are many not-for-profits that have formed to serve an industry. But you were already a not-for-profit, Phenos, and you were already working in the open source community. Why did you join the Linux Foundation? What were the benefits of moving to the Linux Foundation?
Well, for one, they have amazing swag. Kidding aside, jokes apart. I mean, we've had several conversations with the Linux Foundation over the years. Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, together with his team, has really impacted so many industries out there, from automotive to, really you name it, climate, energy, several horizontal foundations creating really the backbone of the modern technology stack. And so I think the best way to explain that is really the potential for, I think there's really mainly two reasons. The first one is the huge potential and the huge, complementarity, if you want, of our value propositions. If you think about it, the Linux Foundation, whether you're talking about Linux, Hyperledger, Node, They really have, very much the most important pieces of technology. Is the biggest shared technology investment out there. And generally, their foundations are horizontal. These pieces of software do apply to several industries. Again, they are the backbone of our stacks. On the flip side, we've always been a vertical foundation, very much focused on, again, financial services, business problems, and technology challenges. So it was, a long time coming that we could look to collaborate and really, Phenos help to bring some of the open source value closer to the end users. I think that's actually a really important trend that we're seeing this year. Partly with Phenos joining the Linux Foundation, but also, you're seeing it in, initiatives like LF Public Health, or again, more recently, LF Climate. You're seeing more and more open source moving from, being largely driven by technology organizations, by technology vendor, to actually be, having end users and the actual consumers, which are by and large technology organizations themselves, taking the step towards leading open source projects, contributing to the community. And I think that's what Phenos has, done a really great job at. 5 years ago, having Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, you name them, actually directly contributing their intellectual property to the open source community was very much unheard of. I mean, this industry has certainly, like most industries, consumed open source. They're huge consumers of open source, to different degrees of efficiency and sort of strategic vision. But over the last few years, we've seen, massive technology organizations. I think one of my board members has probably 60,000 developers working for him. And those are huge numbers. And if you can deploy just a small fraction of that to actually deliver, again, mutualized solutions from common problems that exist in the industry, well, that's a game changer. And so I think, bringing together the, again, technology value of open source with the business focus that we always, stewarded as Phenos was really the main, driver for this collaboration to happen.
That's great. And also, you've mentioned this large community. It's regulated. The insurance industry is regulated as well.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure anything that you're developing, they're very interested in what you're developing and how it's going to work and how it's going to serve the markets going forward.
Yep.
So how do you work with the regulators?
It's a really good question. And actually, we have just launched about 6 months ago what we call our open source financial regulation initiative. But before I go there, I think it's important to understand that when you think about open source collaboration, and of course here we're talking about, largely corporate-driven open source collaboration. Of course, we have individual contributors. This is open source. Anyone can access and contribute to the code. But certainly, we are, as a 501c6 organization now under the Linux Foundation, we are here to forward the interest of the whole industry. Therefore, there's a really, really strong sort of corporate focus here. And so it's important to understand that typically when open source collaboration happens at this level, it is about solving, again, problems which are shared among the industry, so the requirements are common. And generally, these are problems that are, non-differentiating. This is not charity. Nobody's going to give out their secret sauce. This is really about collaborating on areas that, are going to make the industry better, and largely the business opportunities for each of the constituencies, larger and better as well. So it's a positive sum game. So when you think about it, when you think about open source collaboration through that lenses, well, you realize that, regulatory implementation actually fits many of these boxes. It's a common requirement. It's not necessarily differentiating between the different firms because, again, everyone has to comply to it. And so that's what's sparked for us starting to really more concretely looking at, okay, how do we bring the regulators in these conversations? We think that open source, not only enables a better technology, but a big part of what we do as a foundation is manage governance. It's ensuring that there is transparency. It's ensuring that everyone has a chance to actually, participate to the specification and to the implementation process. And so when you again extrapolate all these qualities, you realize that, well, some of the problems the regulators are trying to solve not only can benefit from transparency, transparency is a word that regulators definitely enjoy, but also you realize that those are very complex problems at the crossroads of technology and policy. And again, open source has proven over and over again that it's not just about technology. It's truly about the collaborative process and the collaborative model that you apply to building technology. And so that was a realization for us, somewhere last year, got validated by the board. Of course, as you know, we want to be very careful as to how we engage with regulators. It is, always a very, very tricky subject. But we think that, again, open source has proven over and over again that transparency delivers, the best results there. And so our goal right now, just being specific with this introductory hat, is really to continue creating awareness with regulators. We've had several, events and roundtables with regulators to really try to get them involved as soon as possible in the process. Of course, there's a vision for us in a 5-10 years time frame that we'd love even regulators to produce regulation in an open source format, in a machine readable format. And of course, we are grounded in the way that we don't expect that to happen immediately. But I've certainly seen a lot of innovative thinking in the regulatory community. In a way, there's so many good ideas. There's so many, there's so much desire to do the right thing. It's just really hard to go about it. And sometimes, we think open source can actually really be the solution. And so, again, just wrapping on your question, we have created recently a special interest group. Actually, it's under formation right now. We're looking to approve it at our next board meeting. It's really going to be about innovative regulation. We will start by identifying several use cases, of course, KYC AML being one example that keeps coming up. But we think that there is a lot of opportunity to, again, not necessarily share data right away. That's a pretty complex value proposition, but at least the tools and the standards that underpin that data, that is a fundamental value proposition that I think, no one can or should object to, especially if we go back to, the vendor lock-in prevention, which I think we are all very, very, focused on. And so the second angle here is bringing them along for the ride in terms of, in this industry over the last 5 years, we interacted with, firms that are sort of at different levels of the spectrum of what we call open source readiness, from those who are just starting to learn how to consume to those who already, again, use open source as a strategic vehicle, to forward their business model. And so we think that something similar is needed for the regulators. There are certain regulators who are very much ahead in terms of their open source thinking. Both here, there's a couple both here in the US and in the UK, which are sort of the two main geographies we interact with. But there's of course still a lot of myths and sometimes misconceptions about open source and how it can be used. productively and effectively for regulatory implementation and, of course, enforcement. So a combination of helping them along the way, but I have to say that the first interaction over the last few months have been, I think much more promising and much more productive than I thought they would have.
I agree 100% that involving the regulators in the process early on is really important. Their role is really to ensure a healthy market. And protect the consumer. And they do want to create really good policy, and they need to work with their industry to do that. What the open source community provides is an environment where competitors or organizations that don't necessarily trust one another, they have a place to come together and to collaborate on industry-wide solutions that are really just like core infrastructure, that let's go ahead and set the bar to a certain level where we can then all build on top of that instead of kind of reinventing that infrastructure over and over again. And certainly having the regulators as part of that process is really important. But you also mentioned that you're bringing in members with a wide range of understanding of what it means to be part of the open source community. So you probably have fintech companies that are in the technology community and they understand open source and they're ready to get going. You have all the way to the largest institutions that don't even know that they're using open source technology inside their machine rooms. It's part of their strategy, whether they know it or not. So how do you bring that community together? How do you help them understand the strategic value of open source? How to work together in this environment? It's new, it's foreign, it's a wide range of cultures now coming together into this one community. So how do you work with them to begin developing these common solutions for an industry?
Well, that's a really good question. And, it's certainly one that, candidly took us a while to nail in terms of how we go about it. So I think the best way to sort of answer that question is with an understanding that, again, you mentioned fintechs. I would argue that actually, when I look at, again, the constituents of our community, investment banks and, buy-side firms, several fintech vendors, as you mentioned, but also our sort of more big tech vendors, GitHub, Red Hat, GitLab, several open source infrastructure providers. Of course, the latter class, it's very expert in open source. I think it's the sort of least best kept secret in here in the Silicon Valley. I think open source is fundamentally one of the competitive advantages that exists in this industry, or sort of in the technology industry with respect to some of the more enterprise businesses out there. But I gotta say, the fintech firms are maybe nowhere nearly as expert in open source business models as one would think. Being in the technology, being natively technology players. I would even argue that right now some of our large financial institutions might even be further ahead than some of the fintechs that we interact with in terms of their strategic understanding of how to leverage open source. But having said that, you're absolutely right. Over the last 5 years, we interacted from the nightmare scenario of, no, we're not using open source. Well, actually, yes, you do, and you don't know. And that is a huge issue, especially in a regulated industry. You want to make sure that you are able to, developers will always find a way. I've been a developer myself, and as much as I wasn't working in a regulated industry 20 years ago, I still remember, as an open source consultant going into customers, and they told me, well, sorry, we don't have access to Google here. I'm like, how am I going to be able to do my job? I'm an open source consultant. I live off the internet and mailing lists and documentation websites. But the good news is that several firms have moved on from that sort of place, and we have a strong, what we call open source readiness program. I think it's been, especially in the first few years, a major differentiator for us. If you look at other foundations, some of them have the luck, if you want, to work with, to your point, the extremely expert open source organizations. And so there's not really a lot of need for handholding. From the very beginning, we realized that a strong open source readiness enablement program that really goes along the drivers of, to your point, strategy, it starts top down. We need to have executive air cover as to why open source is important, for your technology strategy, whatever your goals are, attracting talent, reducing cost, really commoditizing a competitor. The most, advanced open source plays are really sort of strategic in nature. So I think that's the first component. And then in terms of the how, so once we, and it's not always a sort of a serial process, a sequential process. Let's say that these streams, sometimes they work in parallel, but once the why is understood, then it's about, the legal, technical, and cultural aspects of how do you enable your organization to actually being able to contribute. And again, this is not charity. It's simply the fact that if you only consume open source, you're likely going to end up having to maintain your own copy of the code. If you say you want to do a patch, fix a bug, and you're not able to contribute it back as upstream, well, you're likely going to end up with the total cost of ownership for your technology that is probably more or worse than proprietary software. Might as well use proprietary software at that point. And so when you actually are able to pass that, again, strategic message, well, then it's about working with the lawyers. We've also, we've always had sort of this call from the developers in these financial institutions. So please help us talk to legal and compliance. We speak two very different languages. Of course they're doing their job. They are protecting and making sure that they're managing the risk for their firm. It's absolutely, I want to make sure that in every interview that I do and every conversation that I do, it's never about shooting on the lawyers. The lawyers are actually doing their job. It's about creating understanding that open source over the last 30 years has proven to be not only a very effective way of collaborating, but also compliant in terms of regulations and how these firms should collaborate. It's a proven to be compliant way of collaborating. And so there's a lot of precedent out there. And so that actually gets the lawyers and the compliance folks, in a much better stance. And so that's really the first sort of pillar of how we got there. And then you start working on the technology tool chain. As I sort of joked about, not having access to Google before, but, until a few years ago, it's highly likely that a developer at JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley did not have access to GitHub. They could not just even look at open source code out there. And so, if you start from that standpoint, all the way to, as an individual working for financial institutions, you're actually not only able to contribute to the open source community, but also do it with your own personal profile. It's absolutely important because, again, I wouldn't be here if 20 years ago I did not contribute to open source. That, of course, is a positive sum game that should deliver value to your company and to you as an individual. And so enabling the technology toolchain for a controlled but frictionless as much as possible open source contribution workflow is certainly the second pillar. And then finally, culture. Sometimes it's a bit of an overrated word, but when it comes to a regulated, generally very conservative and siloed industry, there's a lot of education that needs to be done on why open source is not threatening, why it is actually, again, a compliant way to collaborate, why you're not giving away your secret sauce or your competitive differentiator. But again, if you look at statistics out there, there's probably 80 to 90% of the stacks within a modern enterprise company that is just non-differentiating, especially as we move into platform economies, decentralized ecosystems, the very word of cloud and SaaS. It is clearer and clearer that the competitive differentiator from a technology standpoint is much thinner than we used to think. And so again, start with the strategy and then create the technology, legal, and cultural pillars for open source to happen.
Well, it's interesting. So now you're working with these institutions. It's kind of change management. You're changing the view of open source. You're changing the culture. And yes, it's been around technology. You've been kind of opening up how that's developed. Do you see other areas in the financial services industry where they may adopt open source for other business solutions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at our history, our footprint has been largely in investment banking and capital markets. I mean, that really spawns out our previous incarnation as the Symphony Software Foundation, which is largely a collaboration platform for traders. Now that we're seeing active contribution from several banks, so we think we've reached escape velocity, if you want, in terms of how sustainable our community is. There's certainly a few areas that we're looking at. The first one is certainly more related to consumer banking and retail banking. Over the last few years, whether mandated by regulators like the sort of open banking movement, or simply because challenged by the new challenger banks and fintech firms, there clearly has been innovation in the way of providing APIs, offering a much more, if you want, fluid ecosystem. I wouldn't call it yet an open ecosystem, but I think we are going in that direction. And so I think certainly for us, this year, especially the latter part of the year, has been around exploring how we can, apply the same successes that we've seen in the investment banking side of the house more towards, again, broadly retail banking. I think we touched on regulators. For us, regulatory implementation and common, again, getting to the point that, regulators can actually write regulations in the open, or at least partake to our development process. Because I think the one area there that it's not always clear is that it's not just about mutualizing implementation, it's also about mutualizing interpretation, which is a huge legal cost that each of these institutions do undertake every year. I mean, the regulations, I'll just make a concrete example. One of our areas of collaboration is around cloud service certification. By the way, an area that is by no means limited to just the financial services industry. This is one of the examples of very horizontally applicable projects that we have. If you think about regulations around cloud and public cloud deployments, well, they typically come in the form of pretty lengthy, sometimes, hard to interpret and just sort of bridge onto what it exactly means for modern cloud technology. And so we realized, working with our main stakeholders, that there was a big potential to mutualize the interpretation step and come to a sort of technology-driven, machine-readable interpretation of those regulations. And I think that's a pattern that we're going to see more and more play out. Of course, beyond financial services, we think that other regulated industries, and we hope that other regulated industries, like, for example, insurance, can start taking value from, some of the deliverables that we put forward. Especially when it comes to open source readiness, we have a reference open source contribution policy. We have, business value of open source white paper. So we have produced a lot of material that actually can be largely applicable for, other regulated industries. And so I think that's certainly an area that we'll be looking at in the future.
Well, great. I think it's a good time for us to open up for questions. So for our audience, please use the form just at the bottom of your screen to send your questions in. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, Gabriel, we've talked a lot about the opportunity, about moving forward. What do you see the barriers being to acceptance of open source and moving forward? What are those things that you're attacking first to move them out of your way?
So I think the main misconception that is left, and again, of course, I'm pretty biased, as our members have come a long way over the last few years. And so if you ask me the same question probably 3 years ago, I would have, answered to you around, something around open source readiness, something around enabling banks to effectively contribute to open source. I think right now the biggest challenge for us is many of the banks are actually contributing. I think we haven't seen this level of engagement, nowhere nearly in previous open source projects or previous open source endeavors. I think we still have some ways to go into, again, you mentioned change management. Change management always needs a bottom-up and a top-down push. And I think, whilst we work at the highest levels of these organizations, I think our next big challenge, and I think you're going to see it in 2021 play out, is really to work, with the CIOs to identify even more compelling industry-wide challenges. One area that we are exploring a lot this year is working with other consortia in the very same way that we've enabled individual institutions to, take the plunge of open source. We think we can play a key role, again, along the lines of what we do with regulators, with existing industry consortia. There are plenty of consortia which are doing great work and trying to solve very compelling problems, and in many cases have the right people at the table, and both the right stakeholders and the right vendors. But oftentimes, what they produce falls short in terms of adoption and pervasive usage in the industry. And we think that a lot of that is because of the lack of open source, meaning the lack of a reference implementation, the lack of frictionless ways for developers to take that standard and embed them in their software, and off you go. And again, I've participated both to standard bodies and open source projects in the past. I know that those are typically very different people in terms of background and how they go about solving problems. But between Phenos and the Linux Foundation, we've seen several examples of how, bringing those two worlds together, accelerates adoption, accelerates iteration, and really improvements of the standards. And so I think this industry and regulated industries are very familiar with industry-wide consortia and sort of their mode of operation. I think for us, the big challenge will be, become open source enablers for existing consortia in the same way that we've done for individual organizations. And, you'll hear a few announcements later in the year that really go in this direction. We think that's a really promising avenue.
Okay, great. Well, our audience here has a lot of our insurance company members today, and they're interested in how open source really works. So we're just learning. We're kind of a little bit behind Phenos in that respect. So are there any opportunities in the open source community, especially between, say, the financial services industry and the insurance industry, to take advantage of collaboration in this open source community. So we're new. Can we take advantage of where you are today and maybe begin collaborating, bringing some of the things that we have that accelerates where you're going?
Absolutely. So I think one area is, what we mentioned before. It's especially, I think, useful for, again, an industry that is approaching open source collaboration. And I think it's the work we've done around open source readiness, especially now with the Linux Foundation. In addition to all the material that we produced around, again, we have a reference open source contribution policy. Are you looking to set up to enable your company to contribute back to open source? Well, we have a reference implementation that is battle tested, was originally contributed by one of our financial institutions. You can take it. Again, it's open source, it's free. It is a reusable license. I think that's a really good starting point. I think the second area is the work that we're doing on data. When we consistently realize that when you start approaching open collaboration, open standards is something that people are more familiar with since we standardized sockets and screws hundreds of years ago. And certainly data is an area that, goes hand in hand with standards. And so I think areas around, for example, we announced last year the intent from Goldman Sachs to contribute a pretty substantial piece of software called Alloy with an underlying language called Pure. And this is the logical modeling platform that Goldman uses across their whole organization. It's production ready. It is used for, all the way from regulatory reporting to, pricing, risk models. Of course, that's, part of their secret sauce. They're not going to give out the models and how they build them, but the whole infrastructure is actually now being open source. And so, there's a couple of opportunities there. One is the obvious, hey, take the platform, deploy it internally, play around with it. It's very mature. It does connect and has several connectors to any type of data source that you'd like to model and orchestrate and harmonize. But what we realized is that, the announcement of the contribution happened last year. We took the software from Goldman, we hosted it at Phenos, and we are now hosting several pilots on this platform. That has shown a lot of potential to really bridge, again, this business value of open source with the technical value of open source. By running these pilots ourselves in a trusted, independent, environment, we enabled business folks directly to come and collaborate on, again, problems that are very close to their hearts, that they experience on a day-by-day basis, without having necessary to engage their developers, because we have this very high-level visual platform that allows them to do that. And so I think that might be another area where, there is opportunity, whether it is, again, I guess the bottom line there is, don't be daunted by open source. It is not daunting. It is, again, at the crossroads of technology and policy, a great way to collaborate. If you don't know where to start, and of course, we have a lot of material that you can start using. Again, also with the Linux Foundation, the to-do group is a really good reference for people who are starting to join the open source community. But I think, again, we're in our interactions with data and data standards and our interactions with regulators is, I think, where there might be already some really concrete opportunities for the insurance industry to play along.
And hopefully with openIDL focused on data as well, there may be some opportunities also. Well, I think that's about the time that we have today. I'm sorry to have to shut the conversation off right now. I'd like to continue talking about what you're doing and how we could work together. So thanks again, Gabrielle. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm excited to see where insurance can go with open source, since we're just starting on our journey here. I think there's lots of opportunity for the insurance industry, And I hope lots of opportunities for us to work with Phenos as well. So thank you so much. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you, Joan.